For decades, one detail about the Great Sphinx has quietly bothered archaeologists more than almost anything else about it. The face doesn't match the body. Stand in front of the Sphinx today and look at the proportions. The head is noticeably smaller than what the body seems to call for, tucked in tight where a full royal headdress and a proportionally larger face would be expected on a figure of that scale. For years, this was treated as a minor curiosity, something to mention in passing during a lecture. Then a team working with forensic reconstruction software, the same category of tools police departments use to age progress missing persons cases and rebuild suspect composites from partial skeletal remains, ran a full analysis of the Sphinx's surviving facial geometry. What came back didn't just refine our picture of an eroded monument, it reopened a debate that Egyptology has never fully settled, about who the face actually belonged to, whether it was recarved at some point in antiquity, and why the most famous face in the ancient world doesn't cleanly match any of the royal portraits it's supposed to represent. Before getting into what the Reconstruction found, it's worth being upfront about what this kind of AI work actually is and isn't. This is not radar-penetrating rock to reveal a hidden chamber. There's no new physical discovery buried under sand here. What forensic and generative reconstruction software does is take the existing, measurable geometry of a damaged face, the surviving bone structure of the stone, so to speak, the brow ridge, the cheek angle, the remaining jawline, and use pattern matching trained on comparable faces to propose what the missing sections most likely look like. It's the same logic used every day in cold case forensics, where a partial skull gets a plausible face built back onto it based on tissue depth data and statistical modeling. Applied to the Sphinx, the software isn't guessing randomly. It's extrapolating from what's actually still there, which is more than people assume, since a huge percentage of the underlying stone structure of the face survives, even though the surface details are heavily eroded. The story of why the Sphinx's face is in the condition it's in is itself worth walking through, because most people have heard a version of it that isn't true. The popular claim for centuries was that Napoleon's soldiers shot the nose off with a cannon during the French campaign in Egypt in 1798. It's a great story. It's also almost certainly false. Sketches of the Sphinx, made by the Danish explorer Frederick Louis Norden decades before Napoleon ever set foot in Egypt, already show the nose missing. The far more credible account comes from the medieval Egyptian historian al-Makrizi, writing in the 15th century, who recorded that a Sufi named Muhammad Sarim al-Dahir defaced the Sphinx in the 1300s, chiseling away at the nose and face, reportedly in response to local peasants making offerings to the statue in hopes of a good harvest, which he considered idolatrous. Al-Makrizi's account even describes Saim al-Dar being executed for the act, once locals connected the ensuing crop failures, which they blamed on the desecration, back to him. So the missing nose likely isn't the result of a single dramatic moment of 18th century artillery fire. It's the product of deliberate, targeted damage carried out roughly 600 years ago, layered on top of thousands of years of ordinary wind and sand erosion that had already been softening the face for millennia before that. This actually matters for the reconstruction work, because deliberate chisel damage and slow natural erosion leave very different signatures on stone. Wind erosion tends to round and smooth surfaces gradually and fairly evenly. Chisel marks leave sharper, more angular removal patterns concentrated in specific areas, in this case the nose and a portion of the surrounding cheek. When researchers scan the face with high-resolution photogrammetry, essentially building a precise, three-dimensional digital model from thousands of overlapping photographs, they can actually distinguish between these two types of surface loss. That distinction is part of what feeds into a reconstruction model. It's not just filling in a blank. It's identifying which parts of the blank are missing because of erosion, which can be modeled with fairly standard geological weathering data, and which parts are missing because someone specifically removed them, which requires working from proportional and stylistic inference instead. Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting, and where the story connects back to a debate that's been simmering in Egyptology since long before anyone had access to AI modeling software. In the mid-1990s, a forensic artist named Frank Domingo, who spent decades doing composite facial reconstruction work for the New York City Police Department, was brought in as part of a television documentary investigation to compare the surviving facial geometry of the Sphinx against the well-documented statues of the Pharaoh Khafre, who ruled during the 4th Dynasty and is traditionally credited as the Sphinx's likely model, largely because his pyramid and valley temple sit right beside it. Domingo used the same measurement techniques he'd apply to any police lineup or missing persons case, comparing angle of the brow, projection of the cheekbones, and the ratio between different facial landmarks. His conclusion, which caused a real stir at the time, was that the proportions of the Sphinx's face did not match Khafre's known statues particularly well. The jaw angle in particular seemed off, and the overall facial ratio he measured pointed toward a different individual, not conclusively toward any other named pharaoh, but away from a confident match with Khafre specifically. It's important to be honest about where this claim actually stands. Domingo's analysis has never been accepted as settled fact by mainstream Egyptology, and there are real methodological limits to comparing a heavily eroded 6-story limestone carving against small-scale statuary, using techniques designed for photographs of living human faces. Stone doesn't behave like soft tissue, erosion doesn't distribute evenly, and a single forensic artist's measurements, however experienced, aren't the same as a peer-reviewed, independently replicated study. Most Egyptologists still consider Khafre the most likely candidate for the Sphinx's face, largely based on its location directly in his temple complex and stylistic details in the headdress that match his era. But Domingo's work never went away either, and it's exactly the kind of open question that a more rigorous computational reconstruction is now capable of testing far more precisely than one skilled human working with calipers and photographs 30 years ago. That's essentially what the recent modeling work has done, using generative and forensic reconstruction techniques trained on a dataset of 4th Dynasty royal statuary, including multiple surviving depictions of Khafre and other pharaohs from the same period, to establish the expected proportional range for royal portraiture of that specific era. The software then compares the Sphinx's surviving geometry against that range. Early results being circulated from this kind of analysis land somewhere in between the two extremes of the old debate. The surviving proportions of the Sphinx aren't a clean, confident match to Khafre's documented statues, which lines up with what Domingo flagged decades ago, but they're also not so far outside the expected range for the period that they demand a completely different explanation. What the modeling adds that wasn't available before is a much more granular map of exactly which facial regions match expected 4th Dynasty royal proportions and which ones fall outside it. And interestingly, most of the divergence clusters specifically around the nose and lower face, the exact region that historical accounts already tell us was deliberately damaged in the 14th century. That's an important detail because it suggests at least part of the apparent proportional mismatch that fueled the original controversy may be an artifact of where the damage happened to occur, rather than definitive evidence that the face never depicted Khafre at all. It doesn't fully resolve the debate, but it does meaningfully narrow it, and it does so by actually separating what erosion and vandalism removed from what was carved this way on purpose, which is something no one could do with real precision before detailed digital scanning existed. There's a second layer to this story that gets far less attention, but might actually be more significant, and it has nothing to do with whose face it is and everything to do with when the head was carved relative to the body. Multiple researchers, working independently of any AI reconstruction project, have pointed out for years that the head of the Sphinx appears disproportionately small compared to its lion body, and that the neck shows signs of significant reworking, as though a substantial amount of stone was removed from around the head at some point, effectively recarving it into a new, smaller shape. One widely discussed hypothesis is that the original head, carved from the same natural limestone outcrop as the body during the initial construction phase, may have originally depicted something else, possibly even a lion's head to match the body, or an earlier royal face that was later recut into the likeness we see today, whether that recutting happened under Khafre himself, or a later pharaoh choosing to reclaim the monument in his own image. Ancient Egyptian rulers absolutely did this kind of thing elsewhere, recarving and reappropriating earlier monuments to feature a current ruler's likeness is a well-documented practice across multiple dynasties. It wouldn't be unusual for the Sphinx to have been touched by that same tradition. The reconstruction modeling work is useful here too, because comparing the proportional relationship between the head and neck against what a geometrically consistent single-phase carvings should look like can help quantify just how much recarving likely happened and roughly when, based on stylistic comparison to headdress and neck-shaping conventions from different periods of Old Kingdom sculpture. It's worth pausing here to say plainly what a responsible version of this story does not claim, because there's a version of this topic that gets told online that leans hard into water erosion theories, suggesting the Sphinx is thousands of years older than the pyramids, built by some unidentified earlier civilization before Egyptian dynastic history even began. That version of the story, most associated with the geologist Robert Schuss's water erosion hypothesis from the 1990s, remains firmly outside mainstream Egyptological and geological consensus. The core of that argument is that certain erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure walls look like they were caused by heavy rainfall, which would require a much wetter climate than existed in Egypt during Khafre's reign, pushing the monument's origin back thousands of years earlier. The mainstream rebuttal, which most geologists studying the site accept, is that the erosion patterns are more consistent with wind-driven sand abrasion combined with limestone-specific weathering behavior, and that dating the surrounding quarry marks, construction, techniques, and the Sphinx's clear integration with Khafre's Valley temple complex all point firmly to the same 4th Dynasty timeframe as the pyramids themselves. None of the AI facial reconstruction work changes or engages with that dating debate at all. It's a completely separate question about geology and enclosure wall weathering, not about facial proportions. And conflating the two is one of the most common ways this topic gets sensationalized online. The honest reconstruction story is about who the face most likely depicts and how much of it was altered over time, not about rewriting when the monument itself was built. So what does the current best reconstruction actually look like based on all of this combined evidence? A face with a strong, straight brow line consistent with 4th Dynasty royal portraiture. A broader, more pronounced nose than the Sphinx's damaged profile currently suggests, based on modeling the missing chisel-damaged section against comparable statuary. A square jaw that partially, though not completely, aligns with Khafre's documented likeness, and a headdress. The Nemes, styled with a specific pleating pattern typical of royal portraits from that exact period, rather than earlier or later dynastic styles. It's a face that looks confidently, unmistakably, Old Kingdom Egyptian royal, but one that resists being stamped with total certainty as any single named pharaoh. Because 4,500 years of weathering plus roughly 600 years of deliberate damage have removed more of the fine-grained individual detail than any reconstruction, however well modeled, can fully restore. What the technology has done isn't hand archaeologists a definitive final answer. It's given them, for the first time, a way to mathematically separate the effects of natural erosion from the effects of deliberate vandalism from the effects of what might be an actual ancient recarving. 3 overlapping layers of change that used to just get lumped together as one vague category called damage. Being able to pull those apart is a genuinely new capability, and it's already reshaping how seriously researchers are willing to take the old forensic mismatch that Frank Domingo first flagged back in the 1990s using nothing but photographs and a trained eye. What makes this whole story worth taking seriously, rather than dismissing as another AI-generated internet curiosity, is that it's not actually inventing a new mystery. The mismatch between the Sphinx's head and body has been sitting in the archaeological record for over a century, visible to anyone who looked closely at the proportions. Domingo's forensic doubts about the Khafre attribution have been part of the academic conversation for 30 years, mostly ignored outside specialist circles because there was no way to test the claim more rigorously than one skilled person's manual measurements. What modern reconstruction modeling adds isn't a revelation, it's resolution, in the literal sense, on a much finer-grained way of looking at a question that's been sitting there the entire time, waiting for the tools to finally catch up to the size of the question being asked. And that, more than any single dramatic image of a reconstructed face, is the actual story here. Not that AI discovered some hidden truth the ancient Egyptians were trying to hide, but that it gave researchers, for the first time, a precise enough instrument to start separating what erosion did, what a vandal did, and what an ancient sculptor's chisel might have deliberately changed on a monument that has been silently holding all 3 kinds of history in the same eroded stone face for 4,500 years.